It started on a quiet night at a lonely observatory that most people in the city hardly remembered existed. The building stood on a hill that always felt a little too windy and a little too cold, even in summer. Inside, however, the warmth of old machines, soft lights, and the calm hum of equipment made the space feel alive. A small research team worked there, usually without much excitement. Their nights were slow, predictable, and filled with routine checks that hardly ever led to anything big. On this particular night, the team expected nothing more than the usual static and cosmic noise. They had run the same tests for months, searching for small patterns or rare signals that might help them understand things far beyond Earth. Most of these sounds were natural, coming from stars, dust clouds, or distant planets that offered nothing unusual. So when a faint, strange tone appeared on one of their monitors, no one reacted at first. It sounded like soft tapping under heavy rain, easily mistaken for background interference. One of the researchers leaned closer, rubbing tired eyes. He assumed it was another glitch, but the tapping didn't fade like normal interference. It kept repeating, slow, steady, and far too intentional to be random. He turned up the volume slightly and listened again, this time with more focus. The sound felt structured, like a message trying to break through a thick wall of noise. He called the others over. They stood around the screen, confused at first. They adjusted the filters, then recalibrated the equipment. Still, the tapping remained. It shifted every few seconds, almost like it wanted to be understood. No one said the word signal out loud yet, because it was too big, too heavy to claim without proof. After an hour of careful checking, they realized something that made the room go unusually silent. The rhythm was repeating in a pattern, not found in any known natural source. It wasn't from a star. It wasn't from a black hole. It wasn't from a satellite or anything Earth had made. It was something else. A soft thrill ran through the room. Not fear, more like a quiet, electric curiosity. They didn't jump or shout. They knew discoveries like this required patience. But inside, each person felt an excitement that pushed away their sleepiness. They recorded every second of it, then ran it through a decoding program, usually meant for sorting out random signals from deep space. The program displayed a faint set of repeating peaks. Those peaks weren't random at all. They were arranged with purpose. The meaning wasn't clear, but the structure was there. Someone finally whispered the question. Everyone else was trying not to say too soon. What if this wasn't just a sound? What if someone had made it? The team spent hours trying to gather proof. They compared the tone with everything stored in their database. Nothing matched. No natural source behaved this way. No known interference created such clean, repeating shapes. Slowly, the idea no longer felt impossible. They were listening to a message. The team began to debate what it meant. Some believed it might simply be a relic from an old object in space, something automatic, like a beacon. Others thought it could be something much more important, a call for help. The tone had a softness to it, like a voice weakened over time. The signal was faint, carrying heavy static as though it had traveled for longer than anyone could imagine. Still, the team avoided jumping to conclusions. Big claims needed big evidence. They replayed the signal over and over, studying its behavior. And with each listen, the tone sounded a little more like someone trying to reach out. Not with words, but with rhythm, because maybe rhythm was all they had. Finally, after hours of careful analysis, a pattern emerged that none of them could ignore. The repeated sequence matched an old, mathematical structure, often theorized to be a universal way to communicate with unknown life. Someone, far away, had used it. The realization changed the atmosphere in the room. The researchers weren't excited anymore. They were serious, responsible. After years of waiting for something unusual, they might have been the first people on the planet to witness a message from beyond Earth. They knew they couldn't keep it to themselves. It was too important. They prepared a detailed report, attaching every recording and every piece of analysis. The lead researcher hesitated for a moment before sending it to the International Scientific Coalition. He took a slow breath, then hit the button. Once the message left the observatory, there was no going back. The team waited, unsure what would happen next. They talked in quiet voices, imagining different outcomes. Maybe the coalition would dismiss it as a glitch. Maybe they would demand more data. Or maybe, just maybe, they would see what the small team already suspected. Hours later, long after sunrise, they received a response. The coalition wanted more information immediately. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Now. They were asked to stay at the observatory, run additional tests, and keep the signal active for monitoring. The tone was still coming through, faint but steady, as though it refused to disappear. Word spread quickly among the larger scientific groups. Soon, more observatories around the world confirmed the same signal. It wasn't local. It wasn't a mistake. It was real. The world woke up that morning, unaware that history had quietly shifted during the night. By noon, speculation had started to spread. A few news outlets caught wind of unusual activity among scientists, but the story wasn't public yet. The coalition tried to control the information, hoping to avoid panic or false claims. Inside the observatory, the team kept listening. The signal grew softer throughout the day, as though whatever had sent it was fading. This worried everyone. If it was a distress call, time might already be running out. That night, the coalition finally released a short public statement. It didn't say much, only that an unusual transmission from deep space had been detected, and further study was underway. People around the world reacted instantly. Some were excited, others anxious. Many simply wanted to know the truth. Meanwhile, the researchers continued to work through the noise, trying to decode more of the pattern. At one point, one of them leaned back and stared at the speaker, listening to the faint tapping that had filled the room for hours. "It feels like someone is knocking," he said quietly. "Like they're waiting for someone to answer." No one disagreed. Late into the night, the team compared the signal to known rescue beacons used by humans. The rhythm felt strangely familiar, not in the sense that it came from Earth, but in the sense that anyone in trouble, any species, might use whatever rhythm they could to say, "We need help." The idea settled heavily in everyone's mind. If the message truly came from a distant world, then whoever sent it had likely been waiting for a long time. The faintness of the tone suggested it was old. Very old. Maybe the senders didn't even exist anymore. Or maybe they were still waiting, barely holding on. The team didn't know which possibility frightened them more, but they knew one thing with certainty. The call wasn't meant to scare anyone. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't demanding. It simply existed, steady and patient, like a hand reaching out in the dark. As the hours passed, more experts from different fields joined the investigation. Communication specialists, mathematicians, astronomers, linguists, each one studying the pattern from their own angle. The observatory became a busy place, filled with quiet footsteps, short conversations, and the constant sound of the signal looping in the background. No one got much sleep that night. By early morning, the coalition finally made a decision. They would classify the signal as a possible distress call. Not confirmed, but possible. It was the most cautious label they could use while still acknowledging the truth. It looked intentional. The announcement stunned the scientific community. For decades, people had searched for signs of life beyond Earth. And now, a weak pattern drifting through space had given them the first real clue. The small team who discovered it watched as their quiet observatory turned into the center of the world's attention. Still, they didn't feel like heroes. They felt more like caretakers of a message they didn't fully understand. They looked at the signal again. It was fragile, scattered, almost broken. But even in its weakness, it carried something unmistakable hope. Whoever sent it must have believed someone out there would hear it. Someone capable of helping. What they never could have imagined was that the ones who found their call would come from a planet known for storms, wild oceans, shifting lands, and creatures built to survive almost anything. Earth, a place many other civilizations might have feared, a place no one would expect to answer with kindness. And yet, here they were, listening, trying to understand, trying to decide what to do. Next, the research team didn't know that this moment would one day be remembered as the beginning of something extraordinary, turning point where two distant worlds changed one another's future. But for now, all they had was a faint tapping sound, a growing sense of responsibility, and a quiet belief that answering the call might matter more than anything they had ever done in their lives. The news did not explode all at once. It spread slowly, like a spark drifting across dry grass, catching one patch and then another, until the whole field quietly began to glow. At first, only a few people knew about the strange signal. Scientists, analysts, communication experts, people who were used to keeping calm, even when working with things that could shake the world. But secrets like this never stayed quiet for long. Too many questions were being asked. Too many unusual meetings were being held behind closed doors. By the next morning, rumors had already escaped into the world. People noticed the unusual movement around observatories. They noticed the way major science centers seemed awake at all hours. And they noticed how the coalition's short, cautious announcement felt more like a doorway than a complete explanation. A transmission from deep space had been detected, they said. It needed further study, they said. Nothing more, but those two simple lines were enough to stir curiosity everywhere. At a news station in the city, a reporter stared at the announcement again and again, trying to read between the lines. In another part of the world, a group of university students crowded around a computer, whispering theories about what could be powerful enough to reach Earth from so far away. Families at kitchen tables talked about the news over breakfast, wondering if it was a mistake or a breakthrough. Some people grew nervous. Others grew excited. And many simply felt a strange mix of both. Still, most people didn't understand the entire weight of what was happening. Not yet. Inside the coalition headquarters, however, the air was heavy with urgency. Panels of experts filled the rooms. People who usually worked quietly, now suddenly being asked to make decisions that could influence the future of the world. They analyzed data in real time, comparing it to decades of archived recordings. They called in astrophysicists, mathematicians, engineers, and linguists, trying to understand the structure of the signal. One realization grew clearer with each hour. The message was not random. It was intentional. There were debates about what to do next. Some believed the information should be kept private until every detail was confirmed. Others argued that the world deserved to know everything as it unfolded. A few were worried about causing unnecessary fear. What if people panicked? What if the story grew wild before the truth could be explained? But the fact remained. If this message was truly a call for help, then hiding it for too long would seem careless, even cruel. While the coalition argued behind closed doors, the world outside continued to hum with speculation. Citizens watched the skies with a mix of wonder and worry, even though there was nothing visible to see. Parents held their children a little closer, unsure of what the future might hold. Students sat in classrooms, distracted by the possibility that humanity was no longer entirely alone. Meanwhile, at the original observatory, where the signal had first been detected, the small research team kept working non-stop. They watched the rhythm fluctuate throughout the day, sometimes fading as though struggling to break through. Other times it grew clearer, as if gathering strength for a moment, before weakening again. By now, other observatories around the globe had also locked onto the same pattern. In remote mountain stations, desert outposts, frozen polar labs, and urban scientific centers, the same sound filled the rooms, a quiet tapping, repeating over and over. The fact that multiple locations heard the same message confirmed one thing. The signal was not a glitch or trick of equipment. It was real. And it was reaching the entire planet. Some experts tried to understand the emotion behind the message. Could a rhythm carry emotion? Some argued no, but others said you didn't need a voice to feel something. The weakness of the signal felt like a trembling hand reaching out from somewhere far away. The pattern was steady, but its fading strength hinted at exhaustion. Like someone calling out for help until the last bit of energy remained. The coalition released another public update, slightly more open than before. They explained that the message was being studied and that early analysis suggested could be purposeful. They avoided big words like alien or extraterrestrial, but people read between the lines anyway. It didn't take long for social media to explode with theories, drawings, animations, jokes, and fears. Some people posted hopeful messages about welcoming new friends from somewhere across the stars. Others expressed worry about the unknown. But many agreed on one thing. If this was truly a call for help, Earth had a responsibility to understand it. Governments met with urgency. Emergency councils gathered in different countries, trying to balance caution with empathy. Some leaders wanted to strengthen defense systems just in case, even though there was no sign of danger. Others insisted that responding with fear would close the door on something that might be historic and peaceful. Still, no one really knew what to expect. In a quiet home on the outskirts of the city, an older man sat on his porch that evening, staring at the faintest star he could see through thin clouds. He held a small radio, listening to every update. The world had changed many times during his life, but this felt different, bigger. He wondered if the senders of the message were anything like humans, if they laughed, if they built things, if they had families, if they felt scared. He wondered how long they had been waiting for someone to hear them. Meanwhile, inside the coalition, the experts continued to analyze the mathematics embedded in the signal. There was something familiar about it, something universal. A structure that could be understood by any advanced civilization, regardless of language or species. Some theorized that this form of communication had been designed specifically to ensure that anyone intelligent enough to detect it would recognize it as more than noise. One analyst noticed a repeating pattern that almost looked like counting, not in human numbers, but in a simple upward sequence. Another specialist found what appeared to be a faint second layer beneath the main rhythm, almost like a whisper under a knock. This second layer was harder to decode, but it suggested complexity, meaning the coalition had to consider something else too. What if this message was old? What if it had been traveling across space for decades, centuries, maybe even longer? The idea that someone had sent out a call for help long before humans were ready to receive it brought an ache to the room. What if the senders had already given up hope? What if they were no longer alive to see the response? Still, the signal felt alive in a way, deliberate, even weak. It had determination. Outside scientific circles, people reacted in their own ways. Artists painted their own interpretations of what the message meant. Children asked their parents if someone in space was sad or lonely. Teachers helped their students turn curiosity into lessons about planets and stars. Musicians tried to recreate the rhythm, some even adding their own melodies. The world felt strangely connected, even though no one fully understood what they were facing. At the observatory, the lead researcher stepped outside for a breath of fresh air after nearly 30 hours of nonstop work. The night sky stretched above him, filled with quiet stars that seemed so peaceful compared to the intense hours he had just spent inside. He wondered what the sender's sky had looked like. Were they staring at their own version of this same darkness when they sent the message? Did they imagine someone like him, tired and curious, listening across unthinkable distances? The researcher re-entered the observatory and joined the others. They were studying the data again, and someone finally discovered something important. The signal repeated on a cycle that matched no known natural pattern. It wasn't tied to any star's rotation or cosmic event. It was timed carefully, intentionally. That discovery pushed the coalition to take the next step. They needed to respond. The idea alone changed everything. Earth had sent messages into space before, but never to someone who had already called out first. Never to a message that sounded like a plea. Sending a response was no longer just a scientific task. It was a moral decision. The coalition released a new public statement later that evening, one that was more open and direct. They announced that the message seemed to be a distress signal from an unknown origin. They clarified that there was no threat detected, no reason to fear sudden danger, but that the situation was unique and required global cooperation. People reacted in millions of ways. Some cried with joy at the idea of first contact happening peacefully. Some worried about the implications. Some felt moved by the idea that someone out there might be in need. And something unexpected happened too. The world, even with all its disagreements and conflicts, felt a strange pull toward unity. For once, every country was looking outward together instead of inward. Every person was sharing the same question. Who sent the message? Why were they in trouble? And could Earth help them? As the coalition prepared plans for a probe that could carry a reply, the small research team looked at the faint tapping on their monitors one more time. It was still there, weak but steady, a voice from somewhere far, away, still waiting, still hoping. What the senders did not know, what they could never have expected, was that the ones answering their call came from a world known for storms, shifting lands, and creatures built to survive anything, humans, shaped by a planet where life had to be strong. A world that some cosmic theories labeled a hard world or even a death world, not because it was dangerous in a cruel way, but because it demanded resilience. And yet, despite that reputation, the people of Earth were preparing to answer the faint call with curiosity, empathy, and a desire to help. The senders had reached across the stars. They had asked for someone. Anyone. And now, for the first time in their long wait, someone was finally listening. Someone was finally coming. The decision to respond came slowly, carefully, and with more debate than anyone had anticipated. The coalition wanted to send a probe, a small spacecraft equipped with instruments that could carry messages, record information, and measure the environment around the signal's source. It was not meant to be flashy or dangerous. It was meant to be a bridge away for humans to show that they were listening and willing to help. Engineers, scientists, and communicators from around the world worked together to design the probe. Every choice mattered. Materials had to withstand cosmic radiation. The instruments had to detect faint signals, and the communication systems had to be able to speak a universal language, something beyond words. The probe also carried recordings of Earth's environments, simple images of people, forests, oceans, and cities, along with greetings in multiple languages. Every detail was a way to say, "We are here. We are peaceful. We want to help." The small team that had discovered the signal spent long nights contributing their experience. They advised on the timing, the signal patterns, the interpretation of the rhythm that had first caught their attention. They suggested ways to mimic its structure so the probe's message would be recognizable and comforting to whoever or whatever had sent the call. Meanwhile, the world outside grew restless. People watched the skies, discussed the probe on forums and in cafes, and debated what kind of beings might have sent the signal. Some imagined creatures that looked like humans. Others imagined forms they could not even describe. Still, the one thing everyone agreed on was that Earth was about to do something it had never done before. For the first time in history, humans were deliberately reaching out to someone far beyond their solar system, answering a plea for help. Finally, after months of preparation, the probe was ready. It was a modest craft, not larger than a small car, but it carried the hopes and curiosity of an entire planet. The launch was broadcast quietly at first, with scientists and engineers gathered around screens, watching every step. Rockets roared to life, shaking the ground beneath the launch platform, and then lifted the probe high into the sky. As it rose, people around the world held their breath. Some whispered prayers, others simply stared, wondering what would happen when the tiny craft reached its destination. The probe quickly left Earth's atmosphere, entering the blackness of space. The transition was smooth, almost eerily quiet after the roar of the launch. The team monitored every movement, every correction in its path, every pulse of energy sent from Earth. The probe carried not just machines, but intentions, carefully encoded into signals and patterns that mimicked the original message. Onboard systems recorded cosmic phenomena, sending data back to Earth as the craft traveled through the void. It passed asteroid belts that rattled its sensors, measured distant magnetic fields, and recorded faint cosmic radiation. Scientists monitored each reading, fascinated by the details of a universe they could only experience indirectly. It was like watching a story unfold in real time, the first chapter being written as they watched Dot at one point. The probe encountered a dense cloud of particles that scattered its instruments' readings. The team back on Earth debated whether to wait it out or adjust its course. Finally, a decision was made to navigate carefully through the edge of the cloud. The readings stabilized, and the probe continued its journey, unharmed but carrying a new set of data that fascinated astrophysicists everywhere. The signal from the distant world grew stronger as the probe approached. Scientists realized that the rhythm they had first detected was not fading as quickly as they had feared. Instead, it seemed to respond, subtly adjusting as if acknowledging the probe's presence. The pattern became clearer, its structure easier to recognize. The possibility that someone or something was aware of the probe's journey thrilled everyone involved. The team at the original observatory watched closely, making small adjustments to the probe's communication. Each transmission sent from Earth mirrored the faint patterns of the original distress signal, echoing its rhythm and subtle variations. It was an attempt to show understanding, to bridge the distance with something familiar to the senders. The process was slow and meticulous, but every success felt like a heartbeat of connection. Days turned into weeks, and the probe's journey continued through vast regions of space, crossing distances so immense that they were difficult for humans to comprehend. Throughout its journey, Earth received small bursts of information. Cosmic storms swept past, altering the probe's trajectory slightly, and the team corrected it carefully. Occasionally, faint hints of gravitational waves caused brief anxiety, but nothing could stop the mission. Every challenge became a learning opportunity, a chance to prove that humans could navigate the void with patience, intelligence, and care. As the probe traveled, the team began to notice changes in the signal itself. The faint tapping that had once seemed fragile now carried subtle shifts, as though the senders were aware of the probe's presence and were reacting in some way. Scientists compared the variations to emotional cues in human communication pauses, accelerations, and slight changes in rhythm that suggested attention or response. It was impossible to be certain, but the thought that they were communicating across light years, even unintentionally, filled everyone with awe. Back on Earth, public interest continued to grow. People followed every update, wondering what the probe would discover. Schools used the mission as a learning opportunity, introducing lessons on astronomy, physics, and communication. Families gathered around devices to watch data visualizations, maps, and simulations. Artists created works inspired by the journey, imagining the distant world sending the distress signal. The world seemed more alive than usual, united in curiosity and hope. In the control rooms, small moments of human connection stood out. Scientists laughed quietly over minor technical errors. Engineers shared stories of past missions, and volunteers brought coffee and snacks to keep everyone awake during long nights. It was a reminder that even in the midst of one of the most important scientific missions in history, the human element remained essential. No matter how advanced the technology, it was humans guiding it, humans interpreting it, and humans carrying the responsibility of responding to a plea from across the star's dot as the probe drew closer to the system that had sent the signal. Sensors picked up a dim, aging sun at the center. The surrounding planets appeared barren, suggesting environmental challenges that had stripped life from much of the system. The probe adjusted its trajectory to focus on an orbiting station, a fragile structure that seemed almost miraculous against the backdrop of a dying world. Sensors detected faint signs of life within the station, weak energy readings that confirmed the senders were still present. The moment of first contact was unlike anything Earth had experienced. The probe played Earth's messages, sequences of sounds, images, and signals carefully designed to mirror the original distress pattern. For hours, there was silence, the faint hum of space the only witness. Then, a subtle shift occurred. A weak reply appeared in the data series of patterns that seemed almost intentional. The senders had responded. They had acknowledged the probe. They were aware that someone had listened. The scientists studying the data felt a mixture of exhilaration and nervousness. This was the moment that would define the mission, the moment when Earth's intentions would be understood or misunderstood. The reply was faint and fragmented, suggesting fragility and limited energy. Yet it carried an unmistakable message. They had hoped someone would come, and they were astonished that someone finally had. For the first time, the researchers glimpsed the beings behind the signal. Small, fragile, and carefully balanced against the harsh conditions of their world, the senders appeared almost delicate. Images reconstructed from sensor data suggested creatures with complex structures, capable of thought and communication, but vulnerable to the challenges of their environment. Their survival depended on ingenuity, patience, and the hope that someone beyond their system would notice. The team on Earth realized that these beings had endured far longer than anyone had expected. Their signal had traveled immense distances, perhaps decades or centuries, seeking someone willing to respond. And now, humans from a world that was harsh in its own way were that response dot as the probe maintained its orbit and continued transmitting Earth's messages. The senders began to reciprocate more clearly. Simple patterns of information hinted at their history, their struggle, and their hope. They revealed that their civilization had once thrived, but faced catastrophic environmental challenges. Their orbital station was a last refuge, designed to preserve knowledge and life as long as possible. Every message from them carried a mixture of urgency and gratitude, a silent acknowledgement of the improbable journey that humans had made simply to answer a call. The team watched with awe as the dialogue unfolded, a careful exchange of understanding that transcended language. Every pattern, every shift in rhythm, every response built trust between two civilizations separated by incomprehensible distances. Humanity's first contact with an alien civilization was not a clash or a battle. It was a connection born from patience, intelligence, and the willingness to listen. By the time the probe began sending back more detailed data, the world understood that this was only the beginning. Earth had made contact, answered a call, and opened the door to knowledge and collaboration that could never have been imagined before. And the beings on the other side, fragile and struggling, now knew that they were no longer alone. For the researchers who had first heard the faint tapping, for the engineers who built the probe, and for everyone who had followed the journey, the moment was more than scientific achievement. It was a reminder of something essential, that listening, understanding, and responding with care could create bridges across the vastest distances, across the most profound unknowns, and perhaps even change the destiny of both worlds. The probe moved carefully around the dim sun, entering the orbit of the damaged station. Sensors picked up weak energy signals and subtle movements inside the structure. The readings were slow to interpret, the data faint, but there was life. Whoever or whatever had sent the signal was still present. It was almost unimaginable that something had survived this long, isolated in orbit around a dying planet. The team on Earth watched the screens in silence, barely daring to breathe. The first detailed images reconstructed from the probe sensors were astonishing. The senders were small, delicate beings, their bodies fragile but intelligent. Every movement seemed deliberate, cautious, and careful. They lived in tight quarters, with simple structures designed for survival, and yet there was evidence of ingenuity everywhere. Tools, storage systems, and preserved items hinted at a civilization that had once been vast and complex. Now, only a fraction remained, sustained by whatever energy and resources they could preserve in orbit. The scientists realized that these beings had survived longer than anyone could have predicted. Their distress signal had been traveling across space for decades, perhaps centuries, before being detected. The tap-like rhythm, once thought simple, now revealed layers of information, urgency, history, even a quiet plea for understanding. It was not just a message, it was a story. The probe played Earth's response, carefully constructed to mirror the original rhythm. Soft sounds, sequences of light, and simple patterns of images broadcast through space, echoing the structure of the distress signal. The senders responded slowly at first, their energy weak but deliberate. The patterns suggested recognition, almost as if they were realizing for the first time that someone had heard them, and understood. Communication was painstakingly slow. Each response took hours to reach the probe, and the probe's replies took equal time to return. But the exchange, though fragile, was alive. Humans were speaking across light years, not with words, but with understanding, rhythm, and intent. Every pattern transmitted was a gesture of empathy, a demonstration that Earth had heard the call and wanted to help. The team monitoring the probe experienced a mix of awe and anxiety. They felt responsible for every decision. If the timing, tone, or pattern was miscalculated, it could confuse the senders or even endanger them. The scientists had to interpret subtle changes in rhythm as carefully as a doctor interprets a patient's heartbeat. Every pause, every acceleration in the signal was meaningful. As hours became days, more information emerged. The beings had a history that was slowly revealed through subtle changes in the sequences they sent. Their civilization had once thrived, spreading across their planet with knowledge, technology, and art. Then environmental catastrophe struck. Resources dwindled, ecosystems collapsed, and the few survivors retreated to orbital stations, hoping to preserve life and knowledge. Their messages contained warnings to the universe, a silent hope that no other civilization would repeat their mistakes. The probe continued to transmit Earth's messages, reinforcing the idea of understanding and support. The senders responded more confidently, showing patterns that suggested they were learning about the probe's intentions. They seemed relieved that someone had crossed the immense distance to answer their call. In that moment, the gap between worlds felt smaller. Distance, time, and even the fragility of life were overcome by simple, shared recognition. Meanwhile, Earth continued to watch. News about the probe's success spread quietly at first, reaching scientific circles and later the public. People marveled at the discovery, imagining the tiny beings living in orbit and the enormity of their situation. Speculation ran wild, but alongside it was hope. Humanity was learning not only about a new civilization, but also about what it meant to respond with empathy across unimaginable distances. The researchers at the observatory returned to the faint tapping that had started it all. They now understood that the rhythm had been far more than a signal. It was a lifeline. The beings who had sent it had waited for someone to care, someone capable of interpreting it not as noise, but as a cry for help. The fact that humans, from a world many might consider harsh or even deadly, had answered seemed to surprise them. It was more than a scientific achievement. It was a moment of connection, a bridge formed across time and space. The probe, though simple, had carried not just technology, but humanity's curiosity, patience, and willingness to respond. The senders, fragile and weary, had finally experienced the relief and astonishment of being heard. The exchanges continued, revealing more about the alien civilization. Tools, structures, and preserved records hinted at intelligence that valued art, science, and knowledge. Even in their weakened state, the beings demonstrated careful thought, planning, and a desire to communicate clearly. It was a civilization that had endured hardship, yet still reached out, still hoped for understanding. Scientists on Earth noticed the emotional undertone in the patterns. The signal contained pauses, accelerations, and repetitions that suggested care and intention. These subtle cues were interpreted as the being's attempts to convey trust, surprise, and gratitude. Humanity was learning a new language, one built not on words, but on intent, pattern, and understanding. Every response strengthened the fragile connection. The probe's images, sequences, and sounds were mirrored in the aliens' replies, creating a rhythm of understanding. Slowly, the beings began to reveal more of their world, sharing what they could about their environment, the collapse of their planet, and the design of their orbital station. Each new piece of information was precious, a glimpse into a world that had endured unimaginable difficulty. Earth realized that this contact was unprecedented. Not only was it the first confirmed communication with an alien civilization, but it was also a lesson in patience, empathy, and careful observation. The humans involved felt the weight of their role. Every choice, every adjustment to the probe, every analysis of the patterns mattered. They were not just scientists. They were witnesses and participants in a story that spanned stars. Public interest grew as more information was shared. People imagined the small beings in orbit, working, surviving, and waiting for someone to answer their call. Children drew pictures of the tiny civilization. Teachers included lessons about communication beyond language, and artists created works inspired by the fragile hope that connected two worlds. Humanity felt a shared purpose, a moment of collective attention and care. Back at the observatory, the original research team marveled at the developments. They reflected on the moment they first heard the faint tapping and realized the enormous responsibility that had followed. That fragile rhythm had become a lifeline, a bridge, and now a dialogue that stretched across unimaginable distances. The humans who had answered the call were learning not only about the senders, but about the depth of patience, care, and resilience required to truly connect with another civilization. As the probe continued to orbit and transmit messages, the senders became more confident. Their responses contained subtle variations that suggested understanding, trust, and relief. They had expected silence or indifference, yet here was a world answering their call with care. It was a moment of astonishment for them, a recognition that they were not alone, that someone had finally listened. The probe's journey had become more than a scientific mission. It was a story of connection, perseverance, and empathy. Humanity was learning how to communicate with beings entirely different from themselves, not through words or images alone, but through understanding, rhythm, and care. The faint tapping that had once seemed simple was now understood as a profound message, a testament to the will to survive and to reach out across the cosmos. The scientists, engineers, and observers felt a quiet pride mixed with awe. They had played a part in something extraordinary, a first contact that was not violent, not fear-driven, but built on patience, understanding, and the willingness to listen. It was a lesson for all of humanity, that even across unimaginable distances, empathy and care could form a bridge between worlds. As Earth watched, the tiny beings in orbit slowly revealed more of themselves, their environment, and their history. They shared the story of their civilization, the collapse of their planet, and the knowledge they had preserved in their orbital station. Each revelation was a gift, a chance to understand and connect, and each response from Earth, carefully crafted to mirror their patterns, reinforced the bond that had begun with a faint, persistent tapping in the dark. As the probe continued its careful orbit around the damaged station, Earth began to understand more about the beings who had sent the distress signal. Each new pattern transmitted back was a lesson in survival, history, and hope. The tiny beings, fragile as they were, carried memories of a civilization that had once been vibrant and strong. Their messages revealed a planet that had thrived in technology and culture, with systems and knowledge that humans could scarcely imagine. Yet, environmental collapse had brought everything to the brink. Only a few had survived, retreating to the orbital station in the hope of preserving what they could. Scientists and linguists on Earth worked tirelessly to decode these transmissions. The rhythm of the messages, initially faint and hesitant, had grown stronger and more deliberate. The beings seemed to realize that someone had finally answered, and their confidence increased with each response from the probe. The Earth team carefully mirrored the patterns in their replies, providing reassurance without altering the delicate structure that the senders had created. It was a conversation, slow and measured, bridging the vast distance between stars. Through these exchanges, Earth learned about the alien civilization's mistakes. They had overused their planet's resources, failed to protect ecosystems, and ignored warning signs until it was too late. Their orbital station was not just a refuge, but a warning, a message for any civilization capable of listening. Every pattern, every sequence, every subtle variation in their transmissions carried fragments of lessons learned through hardship and survival. Humanity began to realize that this contact was not just about communication, it was about understanding, about sharing knowledge that could prevent similar disasters elsewhere. The research team marveled at the ingenuity of the senders. Despite their fragile state, the beings had devised ways to store information, manage energy, and maintain life. Every structure and system in the station reflected careful planning and problem-solving. The humans observed the use of resources, the methods for creating clean energy, and the ways in which the beings preserved their culture and knowledge. It was a civilization that had adapted to survive against immense odds, and yet they had remained willing to reach out across unimaginable distances. As days turned into weeks, the exchange became more fluid. The beings began to share more detailed patterns, sequences that conveyed not only information, but also a sense of emotion and intention. Scientists on Earth noted changes in the rhythm, pauses, and accelerations that suggested relief, curiosity, and even gratitude. The probe mirrored these patterns, and slowly a form of understanding emerged. Communication was no longer a one-way observation, but a dialogue, a careful dance of signals that allowed both civilizations to share knowledge without misunderstanding. Earth responded with images, sounds, and sequences designed to convey friendship, understanding, and hope. The probe carried recordings of Earth's oceans, forests, mountains, and cities, along with simple greetings in multiple languages. The intent was clear, to show that humans had listened and cared. The response was received with clear acknowledgement from the senders, their sequences shifting in ways that suggested they were processing the information and adapting their messages accordingly. Through this ongoing dialogue, humans began to see the fragility and resilience of life in a new light. The alien civilization had survived not through strength or dominance, but through careful planning, patience, and hope. Every sequence sent by the senders was a testament to endurance and intelligence, a reflection of the will to persist even in the face of overwhelming odds. Earth began to understand that the probe was more than a tool. It was a bridge, carrying not just technology, but intent, curiosity, and empathy. As the mission continued, Earth's team noticed patterns that hinted at cultural elements. Symbols embedded in the sequences suggested a form of art, perhaps a way to express beauty or meaning. The use of repetition, symmetry, and rhythm indicated thoughtfulness, suggesting that the beings valued order, expression, and communication. Scientists and artists alike began to interpret these patterns, drawing parallels to human music, visual art, and literature. It was a reminder that intelligence and creativity were universal traits, even in beings whose forms and environments were entirely different. Public interest continued to grow. People around the world followed updates with fascination, imagining the fragile beings living in orbit, maintaining their station, and slowly learning about Earth. Schools used the story as a teaching tool, explaining how communication could transcend language and species. Families watched transmissions on screens, discussing what the messages might mean, and children drew pictures of the distant world. Artists, writers, and musicians created works inspired by the encounter, imagining stories of resilience, hope, and understanding. The small research team that had first detected the faint tapping felt a deep sense of responsibility. They had been the first to hear the call, and now they were witnesses to an unfolding dialogue that might shape the future of both worlds. They marveled at the patience and intelligence of the beings on the other side, recognizing the courage it had taken to send a message into the vast unknown. The faint tapping that had seemed simple at first had become a lifeline, a bridge, and a story of survival and hope. As Earth shared more, the beings began to reveal technical details about their station and methods of survival. They explained how they had managed to conserve energy, purify air and water, and store food. Every detail was valuable, offering lessons that could benefit humans and perhaps other civilizations in the future. The exchange became not just about communication, but about learning and sharing knowledge that could prevent future disasters. The bond between the two civilizations grew stronger with each exchange. The beings on the orbital station had expected silence or perhaps a hostile response. Yet here was a world answering their call with care and patience. The sequences of communication suggested astonishment and relief. For the first time, they realized they were not alone. Someone had listened. Someone had understood. The probe continued to transmit and receive, serving as a lifeline between Earth and the distant station. Each new sequence brought more understanding, more connection, and more trust. Scientists on Earth carefully analyzed the data, interpreting subtle changes in rhythm, pauses, and accelerations. Each pattern was a message, each pause a reflection of thought, and each repetition a sign of intention. As the dialogue unfolded, Earth began to consider the next steps. The probe had succeeded in establishing a connection, but it could only carry limited information. Humans wanted to help in a more tangible way, to provide assistance beyond communication. Plans were discussed for a future mission capable of delivering tools, resources, and volunteers trained in peaceful contact. The goal was clear: to support the fragile civilization, preserve their knowledge, and ensure their survival. Meanwhile, the beings on the station continued to teach humans about their world. They shared star charts, environmental data, and cultural information. Every transmission was a window into their past, their challenges, and their hopes. Humanity was learning not only about an alien civilization, but also about the value of resilience, patience, and careful understanding. The story that had begun with a faint tapping had grown into a dialogue rich with knowledge, emotion, and shared purpose. The team on Earth reflected on the significance of the mission. The first contact was not violent, not fear-driven, but built on empathy, care, and understanding. It was a reminder that connection could transcend distance, species, and the vast unknown. Humanity had answered a call for help, not with power or dominance, but with curiosity, intelligence, and a willingness to learn. As the weeks passed, the bond between the two worlds strengthened. The beings on the station grew more confident, sharing more detailed information about their survival techniques, cultural practices, and environmental lessons. Earth responded with care, sending sequences designed to convey friendship, understanding, and hope. The communication became a rhythm of mutual recognition, a dance of understanding that bridged the gap between stars. Every new transmission was a story, every pattern a reflection of intent, every pause a sign of thought. Humanity was witnessing not just a first contact, but a profound lesson in resilience, empathy, and the power of listening. The faint tapping that had first been heard in a quiet observatory had grown into a dialogue that connected two worlds across the vast expanse of space. As the probe continued its work, the humans involved felt a quiet pride and deep humility. They were part of a story larger than themselves, a story of survival, hope, and understanding. The beings on the other side, fragile and enduring, had reached out across unimaginable distances, and humanity had answered. The connection formed through patience, care, and intent had created a bridge between worlds, a testament to the power of listening and responding with empathy. Earth's team knew that the mission was far from over. The next steps would involve not just communication, but tangible assistance, the delivery of resources and volunteers who could safely engage with the fragile civilization. But for now, the dialogue continued, a steady rhythm of understanding, trust, and hope. Humanity had learned that even across unimaginable distances, empathy and care could build connections that would endure, offering lessons not just for science, but for the very nature of life and survival itself. By the time the final part of the mission had begun, Earth had established a careful and steady dialogue with the beings on the fragile orbital station. The probe continued its orbit, transmitting Earth's sequences of light, sound, and rhythm, and receiving patterns from the senders in response. The dialogue had become more fluid, the initial hesitation fading into a rhythm of understanding. Each exchange revealed more about the alien civilization, their struggles, their ingenuity, and their hope. Humanity was witnessing something profound, a civilization enduring against impossible odds, reaching across the void, and connecting with another species for the first time. The plan for a physical mission had taken shape slowly, with patience and care guiding every decision. Scientists, engineers, and communicators worked together to design a craft that could travel to the orbital station safely, deliver resources, and allow a small team of trained humans to engage with the senders without causing harm. The craft would carry essential supplies, tools to repair and maintain their station, energy sources to stabilize their systems, and food and water optimized for the fragile biology of the beings. Every detail was scrutinized to ensure that no unintended consequences could arise from contact. As preparation continued, Earth remained in constant communication through the probe. Every sequence transmitted was carefully analyzed by both civilizations. The senders revealed more about their technology, their methods for conserving energy, and the intricate systems they had developed to survive in orbit. These details were invaluable, not only for understanding the alien civilization, but also for designing the approaching mission. Humanity realized that they were learning survival lessons from a species that had endured conditions humans could barely imagine. At the same time, the emotional depth of the exchanges became clearer. The subtle shifts in rhythm, the careful accelerations, and the pauses in the sender's signals all conveyed emotion, relief, surprise, curiosity, and even gratitude. Scientists on Earth learned to interpret these patterns as more than data. They were the heartbeat of a civilization, fragile yet enduring, reaching out with hope. Humanity responded with sequences that mirrored these emotional cues, demonstrating empathy and recognition. The dialogue had become something akin to a conversation, one that transcended language and species. The world watched as Earth prepared for its first physical approach to the distant station. Updates were shared cautiously, emphasizing safety and cooperation. People imagined the small beings living in orbit, carefully maintaining their fragile home, and humanity's hope that they would finally receive tangible help. Public interest was immense, but the tone was thoughtful rather than sensational. Humanity understood that the moment required respect, patience, and care. Finally, the launch of the first manned assistance craft occurred. It was modest in size, but carried the most important elements: trained humans, carefully selected supplies, and instruments designed for precise communication. The launch was broadcast widely, not for spectacle, but as a record of history in the making. As the craft left Earth's atmosphere and entered space, scientists and engineers monitored every detail, aware that every decision mattered. The journey would be long, delicate, and unprecedented. As the craft traveled, the probe continued to maintain contact with the station. The senders responded with increasing confidence, their sequences now richer and more deliberate. The rhythm of communication suggested that they were aware of the approaching mission and were preparing for the first direct contact with humans. The exchange carried subtle signs of anticipation, trust, and cautious hope. Every signal was a reminder that two species, separated by unimaginable distances, were learning to understand each other. When the craft approached the station, sensors detected every movement of the fragile beings. The humans on board were instructed to move slowly, deliberately, and with care. They wore equipment that allowed them to interact safely without imposing harm. The beings in the station observed, and the probe relayed their responses. Pauses, subtle shifts, and gentle patterns of movement indicated curiosity and cautious acceptance. It was a moment of profound significance. First physical contact between Earth and a civilization that had waited decades, perhaps centuries, to be heard. The humans on board the craft began delivering supplies, carefully placing tools, energy sources, and food within reach. Every action was deliberate, meant to communicate respect and care. The senders, initially cautious, responded by guiding the humans in ways that ensured safety and efficiency. They demonstrated knowledge of their environment and systems, teaching the humans how to navigate and stabilize their fragile station. Humanity was learning not just through observation, but through direct interaction, a shared process of problem-solving and understanding. Over time, the bond strengthened. The humans provided assistance, the senders shared knowledge, and both civilizations adapted to each other's presence. The station's systems were repaired and stabilized, energy sources optimized, and life support improved. The fragile beings, once uncertain and isolated, began to demonstrate confidence and a renewed sense of hope. The dialogue of sequences and rhythms continued, now enriched by shared experience and mutual understanding. Back on Earth, scientists monitored every step. They observed the interactions, analyzed new transmissions, and ensured that the mission proceeded safely. The planet watched with fascination, imagining the delicate beings and the humans working together in orbit. Schools incorporated lessons about patience, empathy, and problem-solving. Families followed the updates, discussing the significance of humanity reaching across space to help a civilization in need. It was a moment of global reflection on cooperation, care, and responsibility. The senders gradually revealed more of their history, culture, and achievements. They described art, music, scientific discoveries, and ways of life that had flourished before the collapse of their planet. Every revelation was a gift, a testament to the resilience of life, intelligence, and creativity. Humans marveled at their ingenuity and endurance, recognizing that even in fragility, life could thrive and communicate across unimaginable distances. The emotional impact on the humans involved was profound. They felt awe, humility, and a deep sense of responsibility. This was not just a scientific mission. It was a story of survival, connection, and hope. The first contact, once imagined as a distant possibility, had become reality. The fragile beings, waiting for centuries to be heard, had finally received not only attention but tangible aid. Humanity had fulfilled a role that went beyond observation or curiosity. They had answered a call for help as the mission progressed. Further sequences were exchanged, providing detailed lessons in survival, technology, and cultural understanding. The humans learned to replicate the rhythms of the sender's signals more effectively, allowing for smoother communication. Trust and recognition grew, and a sense of partnership emerged. It was no longer simply a mission of assistance. It was a collaborative effort, a union of knowledge, care, and intention. The world on Earth continued to watch, inspired by the example set in orbit. Humanity had demonstrated that across vast distances, empathy, patience, and understanding could create connections stronger than fear or distance. People marveled at the resilience of life, the power of communication, and the importance of listening. It was a story that would be remembered for generations. A story that began with a faint tapping and grew into a bridge between worlds. Eventually, the humans involved in the mission prepared for the final phase, ensuring that the station could sustain life independently for the foreseeable future. Systems were optimized, lessons were shared, and the senders demonstrated that they could now maintain their home with confidence. The bond between the two civilizations had become stronger than anyone had anticipated, built not on power or dominance, but on shared understanding, careful communication, and mutual respect. As the humans prepared to depart, the senders transmitted sequences of gratitude and astonishment. Their messages carried emotion, recognition, and hope. They had expected silence, perhaps indifference, but instead they had experienced care, patience, and empathy. Humanity had crossed the vast distances, answered a call, and forged a connection that transcended species, distance, and fragility. The story of survival and communication had reached its highest point, a moment of triumph for both civilizations. The humans returned to Earth, bringing with them detailed data, experiences, and insights. The probe remained in orbit as a continued link between the worlds. But the physical mission had succeeded in stabilizing the fragile civilization and establishing a sustainable partnership. Scientists, engineers, and communicators on Earth celebrated not just a scientific achievement, but a moral and humanitarian one. Humanity had demonstrated the ability to respond to a call for help across the cosmos, to act with care, understanding, and empathy. The story of the faint tapping, the fragile beings, and the humans who answered it became a lesson for the world. It showed that survival depended not only on strength, but on intelligence, patience, and cooperation. It demonstrated that empathy could bridge unimaginable distances, and that listening could change the fate